Wanderlei Silva, Frankie Edgar, BJ Penn, Royce Gracie, Max Holloway, TJ Dillashaw, Charles Oliveira, Big Nog, Shogun Rua, Valentina Shevchenko, and finally Dan Henderson. The discussion of who the GOAT is. It's diverse, it's personal, and most importantly, it is the most heated debate the sport has to offer.
Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor, GSP. Good, dummy. That's how everybody makes the money.
Moving on to another person who's Kamaru Usman.
What the? One of the best. Maybe.
I've always said Mighty Mouse is one of my best bets.
Of combat sports, I remain number one.
I am one of those guys that takes everything into consideration.
Who the fuck is that guy?
So today, I offer something slightly different. We are going to be recreating the GOAT pyramid. So what separates the GOAT pyramid from a simple tier or ranking system? Well, the pyramid allows us to stack practitioners of combat sports into tiers. It would be steps to greatness, if you will. Each fighter I place will be justified to a criteria that is on screen now, but most importantly, I want to share these athletes' stories, celebrate their highs and show their spectacular performances and moments inside of the cage. And so in celebration of 30 years in the UFC, let's put what I think are the 30 greatest fighters onto this pyramid. We start off with tier 5 GOATs, the bottom of the pyramid, but by no means a slight on any fighter here. And so we start with Wanderlei Silva. But first, a quick message from the sponsor. This video is brought to you by Manscaped.com, the global brand for men's grooming and hygiene products. When Manscaped reached out, I was super excited because, as Derek Lewis knows, down there can be a contention point for most men. Manscaped went ahead and hooked me up with a bunch of stuff from their all-in-one performance package 4.0, and trust me, they're the crown jewels. I mean, just look at everything here. And what stands out straight out of the box is that the quality is just top notch. But what stands out the most is the lawnmower for me. This is Manscaped's 4th generation electric waterproof trimmer and advanced skin safe technology, which reduces nicks and cuts for the most sensitive regions of the body. The Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer has a super smart cordless charging system and these little LED lights on the front to show you how much juice you have left. Up to 90 minutes of use with a full charge. It even has a travel lock feature. Also included in the Performance Package 4.0 are 2 products I never knew I needed until now. The Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant and the Crop Receiver Toner Spray. Simply apply the Crop Preserver after you've hopped out the shower for all-day bodily odor protection. Paired with this is the Crop Receiver. It's a convenient spritz with cooling aloe vera to quickly refresh the area whenever you need it. And Manscaped aren't lying when they tell you that they've got you covered from head to tippy toe. Introducing the Weed Whacker. It's a wireless nose trimmer with the same skin-safe technology as the groin trimmer, so you don't have to worry about tugging or cutting on any of those sensitive nose hairs. For a limited time, you get all of this plus 2 free gifts, the Shed Travel Bag and the Manscaped Anti-Chafing Boxer Briefs. Go to manscaped.com today to get 20% off, plus free international shipping, plus 2 free gifts when you use promo code 20MMA at checkout. Always make sure you use the right tools for the job. Use Manscaped, and thank you so much again for Manscaped for bringing you this video. They don't call you the Axe Murderer for nothing, and Wanderlei Silva will undoubtedly be remembered for his brutal, oftentimes psychopathic moments inside of the cage. In a time where Pride was dominated by jiu-jitsu and catch wrestling, Wanderlei would burst onto the scene to remind audience that being a slightly tamed and juiced serial killer versed in Muay Thai is one of the greatest bases for mixed martial arts. Compelled to violence because his self-confessed ugliness was incapable of picking up girls, he needed an outlet to prove that he was desirable to the opposite sex. An origin story worthy of any man wanting to claim a spot on the coveted GOAT pyramid. Silva's MMA career began in 1999, bouncing between Pride, an organization built on no-rules gladiator-esque bloodshed events, with a theme song to make any man grow hairs on his chest, and the UFC, crossing paths with the likes of Vitor Belfort and Tito Ortiz. Silva was slowly generating a record worthy of any future legend, from wins against the likes of Dan Henderson, and it wasn't until Wanderlei literally kicked Sakuraba's face in with his shin at Pride 13 did Silva's career explode, making the Gracie killer himself question his game plan, crawling around on the floor. Silva would become an overnight sensation, and so he would be catapulted into the MMA freak show that Pride had to offer, and he would claim the middleweight championship, compete in multiple Grand Prix and defend his belt against the likes of Quinton Jackson. By the time his career at Pride had come to an end, he had amassed a record of 31 wins, 5 losses and 1 draw, 1 no contest, even collecting himself himself a 16-fight win streak along the way, cemented with some of the most disturbing finishes you'll ever see. Again, they don't call you the axe murderer for nothing. His time in Pride would be the pinnacle of his time in the sport, because his UFC career would be marred with more losses than wins, but that's okay. Silva ruled over one of the greatest eras of the sport, a time where violence was unrestricted, a time where the sport was trying to figure out what it was. Silva will always be a terrifying and haunting memory as Asian fans watch their idols be sliced to pieces by shooter boxing's very own Ted Bundy. In a sport where longevity is the hardest aspect to maintain, Frankie Edgar stands as a monument to consistency and durability. Debuting in the UFC at UFC 67 in 2007, after just starting the sport 2 years previously, with a record standing at 6-0, Frankie would stay in the top echelon of the 3 divisions he competed in for another 15 years, all the way to UFC 281 in 2022. Perhaps what is most surprising is that each time the man moved divisions, he would drop down to the next weight class, from lightweight all the way down to bantamweight, perhaps the opposite of what most athletes do in the sport. His lightweight run is what he'll be most remembered for. After going 6-1 in his initial UFC outing, Frankie had earned his first shot at UFC Gold, taking on the then reigning champ BJ Penn, in a fight that he was supposed to lose, and one in which he was the smaller man. Frankie stole the show, putting on a dominant and spectacular victory. Frankie would go on to beat the Hall of Famer in 2 other outings over the course of 4 years in 2 different divisions. From the craziest series of fights we will ever see in his title defense against Gray Maynard, to challenging for the featherweight belt on 3 separate occasions against both Jose Aldo and Max Holloway, to defeating rising prospects and legends of the sport, Frankie Edgar deserves a place on this list and will always be remembered for his persistence despite setbacks and shortfalls. Retiring last year with a record of 24 wins, 11 losses and 1 draw, Frankie is a true Hall of Famer, tied with most Fight of the Night bonuses at 8 and sitting in second place with longest total fight time just shy of 8 hours. What more does this man have to prove? Despite what his record may look like on the outside, sitting at 16 wins, 14 losses and 2 draws, BJ Penn is a true legend of the sport, and his incredible run spanning from 2001 to 2011 before his inevitable decline cannot be overlooked. BJ Penn fought the who's who of MMA in multiple divisions, almost always in either title fights or title eliminators. BJ Penn was the embodiment of his Hawaiian warrior ancestors. Acclaim began to swirl through the whispers of the MMA community after Penn's spectacular win over Matt Hughes at UFC 46, by way of rear naked choke in the first round to claim the welterweight belt. Matt Hughes, who had defended the title 5 times by this point and was 35 wins into his career, was the clear favourite in the fight. But not only that, Hughes clearly had the size advantage. Penn would have a contract dispute and leave the UFC after this fight, going on to test himself in the waters of K1, where he would compete at not only middleweight and light heavyweight, but also an openweight fight against the then 225-pound Lyoto Machida. Although he would lose, it just goes to show that weight isn't everything, especially for someone like Penn, who simply didn't care and seemingly had no respect for his own safety. After a few years out of the UFC, he would circle back to fight for the belt he relinquished, but would come up short against Prime GSP, and again in another title fight against Matt Hughes a few months later. Penn would then opt to fight at a more natural weight class, dropping down to lightweight, where he would go on to win the lightweight belt and defend it multiple times against Sean Shirk, Kenny Florian and Diego Sanchez. The latter half of his career would taper off in much the same way it does for most of these athletes. His final win in 2010 was a knockout against Matt Hughes, proving once more size isn't everything. His career was applauded by various outlets, even getting Fighter of the Decade as voted for by Sports Illustrated. He is a UFC Hall of Famer and the 2nd UFC double champion, and interestingly enough, he is the only fighter to have stoppage victories in each of the 5 rounds available. BJ Penn will forever be remembered for his psychotic and violent ways, and the image of him licking his opponent's blood from his gloves will be burned into the memory of fight fans for all the decades to come. Royce Gracie is an easy inclusion on this list, not only for the fact that he propelled MMA into the stratosphere with his win at UFC 1, but also the fact that he upheld the lofty legacy of his family on his shoulders as he entered the cage that night, a family that dominated the Vale Tudo space for decades in his home country of Brazil. Their beautiful form of martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, proved to be the pivotal sport that shaped decades of combat sports. It's very hard to not understate what the name Gracie stands for, and although Royce would have what is considered an extremely short MMA career, his initial run in the UFC will live on forever, winning 3 of the first 4 one-night tournaments, dispatching the likes of Ken Shamrock, Gerard Gordeau and Dan Severn. There won't ever be a day where the word MMA isn't synonymous with the deep roots of the Gracie family and the one-night blood-infused beginnings of the UFC. Royce showed us that his seemingly small size was not a detriment, and that flow and knowledge of leverage and weight shifts are effective in dispatching larger and more powerful opponents. His display of jiu-jitsu at UFC one would start a meteoric rise of the sport, one that makes it still one of the most effective ways of competing in MMA. Whilst his inclusion on this list is relatively short, don't let that fool you. This man will always have his place here, no matter how many greats we see over the next century. If you want to learn more about what this man and his family stand for, then I highly recommend the documentary Fighting in the Age of Loneliness by John Boyce over on Secret Base. Tied at spot number 4 for longest win streak in UFC history at 13 consecutive fights, Max Holloway made a career turnaround that is rarely seen. From going 7-3 with losses to Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor and Dennis Bermudez, Max would revitalize his career in an extraordinary way. After compiling 9 wins in a row over competitions such as Charles Oliveira, the ever-violent Jeremy Stephens, and SoCal Cub Swanson, Holloway would have his first taste of UFC gold by wilting former lightweight champion Anthony Pettis to claim the featherweight interim title. This performance would promise him a shot at the consensus featherweight GOAT and King of Rio, Jose Aldo. Max would not fail to disappoint, beating Jose handily in a barn burner of a fight, and prove it wasn't a fluke by repeating his success again in a rematch. After this, Max would put on a performance of a lifetime, removing Brian Ortega from the League of the Undefeated and serving him a dish that is best served in front of thousands, CTE. After a failed shot at double championship glory in a lightweight interim championship matchup against Dustin, Max would drop back down and cement his featherweight crown by defeating the legend Frankie Edgar. He would, however, meet his match in the form of Volkanovski, a man he would fail to beat in 3 attempts. Betwixt defeats to Alexander the Great, Max would put on boxing clinics against both Kelvin Kattar and Yair Rodriguez. Max for me is a standout in the sport, and always will be. His skill set is far beyond that of most others, and his striking statistics just prove that. In his matchup against Kelvin Kattar, Max would land 445 significant strikes, out of 744 attempted, an impossible number of strikes to even comprehend. And that high of a strike count is a feat that he constantly threatens to match in each of his outings, as he continues to distance himself in perhaps his ultimate record of most significant strikes landed by any fighter, sitting at 2,848 strikes in his entire career, along with a slew of other records such as most finishes in featherweight history, wins at featherweight, winning streak at featherweight. It is no wonder why this Hawaiian is on the list. Whilst he may have fallen short to Volkanovski, I don't think that it should be ever considered a bad thing for me. Max will always be one of the greatest featherweights the sport will know.
Dillashaw to me sits comfortably behind Dominick Cruz as the greatest bantamweight the division has ever known. The only reason TJ is down here and Dom is higher up is because, well, Dom beat TJ, and obviously other factors that we'll get into, but the fact that that fight was so close and hard fought is a monument to how great both of these guys were. TJ was a 2-time bantamweight champion with multiple defenses in each reign, and a man who had finishes in every title fight he won, but the manner in which he claimed the throne for me is one of the most inspiring stories the bantamweight division has ever spewed out. It's one of the greatest underdog stories of all time. TJ would step in against Renan Barão on short notice, and he wasn't doing so to any old champ. Barão was on a 32-fight winning streak and looked dominant in all of his outings. TJ, despite being on the bad side of a lopsided betting line, proceeded to put on a devastating bang Muay Thai clinic courtesy of his head coach Dwayne Ludwig, and it is perhaps his striking, movement and mix-up of all combat sports that truly separates him from other athletes in the sport. Regardless of records and controversies, this man is truly a talent of a generation. His skill set is undoubtedly one of the best the sport has to offer, and for that reason he has made the GOAT pyramid. Injury and run-ins with USADA certainly stunted his career, and there is no doubt in my mind that he would have been higher than even Dom if he had stayed the course and avoided the problems that he had. The whole saga with Team Alpha Male will forever be a highlight of MMA and a standout storyline for me. So there we have it, TJ Dillashaw in tier 5. Joining fellow shootboxing gym member Wanderlei Silva on the list is the former lightweight world champion who was on a huge win streak before entering into the UFC, making his debut at 12-0 and going on to win his first 2 fights in the organisation. But from there, Charles would go back and forth in his career, gaining some wins and then losing some important fights that would have put him into title contention at featherweight. Perhaps the best decision of his career was when he made his way to the lightweight division. Whilst going 1-1 in his initial outing, Oliveira would begin his dominant reign all the way to the lightweight championship. Oliveira would string together one of the longest win streaks the UFC will ever know, sitting at 11, and also break the record for the most submissions and most finishes in UFC history, 13 and 19 respectively. He was either submitting you or knocking you out, and that is perhaps one of the things that puts him on this list. The fact that the man chooses violence above all else and is not afraid to take the fight to his opponents separates him from his peers. The man is exciting to watch in his fearless and destructive approach. Watching him claim the lightweight championship is one of the most heartwarming and beautiful stories the sport will ever know. A future Hall of Famer and record breaker, Oliveira deservedly sits in the discussion of the greatest. Despite his last loss, I feel that Oliveira has a long time time left in the sport and will continue to prove his mettle.
One half of the Nogueira brothers, Big Nog was, well, the counterpart to his twin brother, Little Nog. Both of these men would fight in the UFC in pride, but Big Nog happened to be the most successful out of the two. Whilst perhaps to me he will always be the butt of the joke of one of Chael's most infamous lines, Big Nog is a true legend of the sport and pioneer for heavyweight Brazilians. His career would start by dominating the tournaments of early Japanese fight promotion Rings, a gritty organisation that held some of the first bloodbath tournaments in Asia. Champions of these tournaments include not only Big Nog, but Dan Henderson and Fedor Emelianenko. Fighters are certainly held in high esteem with a win in one of these tournaments. After going 11-1-1 from 1999 to 2001, Big Nog would make his way to Pride, where after stringing 2 wins together against Gary Goodridge and Mark Coleman, would claim the inaugural Pride Heavyweight Championship. No tall order for any combat athlete. Over the next couple of years, Big Nog would cement his legacy by scrapping it out with Dan Henderson, Mirko Krokop and Fabricio Verdum on the canvas of Pride's ring, tying the record with Sakuraba with most submission wins in Pride history. Whilst falling short twice to Fedor and once to Josh Barnett over this time period, Big Nog would make his way to the UFC with a 29-4-1 record, going on to claim the interim heavyweight championship by beating Tim Sylvia. The highs of Big Nog's career are forever locked into the grainy VHS tapes of Pride, where he proved that during that era of ruthless barbarians, he was one of the most devastating opponents you could face in the East, and will forever be held in the hearts and minds of fans of this sport, finishing his career with 34 wins, 10 losses, 1 draw and 1 no contest, 24 of said wins coming by way of stoppage. Big Nog had fought the who's who of both Pride and the UFC, proving he will forever be one of the greatest heavyweights to put on 4-ounce gloves, and so there is no surprise he makes his way onto the tier 5 of this pyramid. And so we move swiftly on to the next fighter on the pyramid, Shogun Rua. A former UFC light heavyweight champion and Hall of Famer, Shogun Rua was an easy choice to make for the pyramid. He joins those before him as a pioneer of the sport. He would start his career similar to those other legends of the sport by competing in Pride, getting fantastic wins over Overeem, Big Nog and Rampage Jackson, culminating in the ultimate prize of winning the 2005 middleweight Grand Prix. During this time he would have the privilege of earning himself finishes by way of both soccer kicks and foot stomps, truly a devastating way to cement a legacy. Those elusive fight-ending sequences, a hazy memory in the cranium of early fans. After knocking out Overeem for the second time and celebrating his 5th year in the sport, Shogun would make his UFC debut, losing at first to Forrest Griffin, but going on to beat both Mark Coleman and the Iceman Chuck Liddell, earning his first shot at UFC Championship glory against the light heavyweight king Lyoto Machida. He would lose in what is considered one of the worst decisions of all time, getting the immediate rematch and opting not to leave it to the judges this time by knocking out Machida in devastating fashion, becoming the 11th UFC light heavyweight champion. His career afterwards would be a slew of wins and losses, ending his career last month with a record of 27 wins, 14 losses and 1 draw. A victim of his own success, choosing to stay in the sport far longer than any practitioners should. But his initial 8-year run in the sport from his debut is nothing short of spectacular and rightly earns him his spot on the pyramid.
One of only 2 females to make the list because, well, clearly I'm sexist, Valentina has certainly proven herself to be one of the most dominant female fighters and combat athletes in the world. If not for her 2 dropped fights against Amanda, she certainly would have been the best right now. Time will tell if she'll finally claim double championship status, and I think that she eventually will, as the MMA community and Dana White himself discuss an inevitable super fight and 3rd fight against Amanda. But right now, notching win after win, ruby after ruby into that legacy belt is for me the most important thing that she can do. Some athletes on the list are enamored with super fights or double championship status and forget that the right and true way to solidify a legacy is to remain in the top of your division and prove there is no one worthy to take your throne, something I think Shevchenko fully understands. With now 7 title defenses, of which half have come by the way of finish, I think that Valentina will certainly climb the pyramid as she marches on. With multiple belts in a storied and lengthy kickboxing record and also several wins in boxing, Valentina proves that she is certainly a skilled and varied mixed martial artist. Her MMA career would also begin in 2003, which is rare for a lot of female fighters, and so to see her remain at the top of multiple sports for so long is a testament as to why she's included on this list.
Dan Henderson's 19-year career is an easy inclusion on this list. The 2-time Olympian, just a single year into his new MMA career, would enter into the 1988 UFC 17 middleweight tournament, going on to win the one-night affair by beating Alan Goes and Carlos Newton. After that, he would take his hand to the Rings tournament system, going on to win the 6-month trial of combat by taking out people like Big Nog and Renato Sobral in the final. And so within 2 years, Henderson had placed 2 massive tournaments under his belt and would go on to spend the next 7 years of his life in Pride, the pinnacle of which he would win the welterweight Grand Prix and a couple years later the Pride middleweight championship against Wanderlei Silva. He would then migrate into the UFC, in which he would lose his first 2 outings, of which were title fights fights against Quinton Jackson and Anderson Silva, light heavyweight and middleweight scraps respectively. After that, he would shut the mouth of Michael Bisping with the signature H-bomb, a knockout so iconic and devastating it literally became Henderson's logo. After some contract disputes, Hendo would leave the UFC in favour of Strikeforce, where he would win the Strikeforce light heavyweight title, before joining back to the UFC to finish out his career with 11 more fights, finalising with a shot at the middleweight title against Michael Bisping. After this fight, Henderson would retire, but he would do so as a Hall of Famer of both the UFC and the National Wrestling Museum. He is another man whose losses don't quite define how good this man truly was. He fought legends his whole career, men who appear on this very pyramid, and so when compared to his peers, there is no doubt in my mind that he belongs in tier 5. So now we go to tier 4. I wrote this section last, and I'm conscious of how long this video is actually getting, so I'm somewhat going to power through this tier to concentrate on the last 3 tiers. So buckle in, and hopefully by this portion of the video, I've either annoyed people to the point of them clicking off the video, or enabled a great discussion on what greatness means down in the comment section. And at this point, I really just want to hammer home that in terms of actual fighting and things like that, I'm not the expert. I'm not the Weasel or the MMA guru or any of those people, not Dan Hardy. And so, I love the stories of MMA. I'm not a fighter. I never will be. And so don't come looking for an expert opinion on all the tiers that follow. It's just a discussion. Don't get upset, love. Either way, I'm here for the hate, so let's crack on to the first fighter in tier 4, Conor McGregor. When he isn't getting blowies on his yacht, being sus on Instagram or fighting in the lightweight division, Conor McGregor was the superstar of this sport. A catalyst for growth for not only the sport as a whole, but most definitely Dana White's and the UFC's pockets. Conor McGregor was 1 in a billion, and I don't think anyone expected his rise in MMA. We witnessed true greatness when he steps into the octagon, particularly at featherweight, when he was motivated, obsessed, and driven for one goal, becoming a 2-divisional champ. There was no stopping him, and whilst his career has waned in recent years, I don't think it takes massively away from what he has done inside and outside of the octagon. His striking, power, timing, and speed, everything was almost perfect. And the competition in which he claimed the UFC lightweight crown against Eddie Alvarez was one of the best performances we've ever seen inside of the cage. It was also the moment that we would see the first ever simultaneous 2-divisional champ. I doubt we'll ever see a personality like him again in the sport, a man capable of selling upwards of 2 million pay-per-views per event, making a generation of fight fans and putting more eyes on the screen than ever before. Whilst his skill set may have been exposed over the course of his lightweight run, those years leading up to his 13-second destruction of featherweight GOAT Jose Aldo was simply a blessing to see. I think the fact that he has not defended any of his titles in either division puts him lower on this pyramid, and the fact that, whilst still in his prime, has lost to the better lightweights in the world. Who knows what we could have seen if he had remained looking like Skeletor and stayed at featherweight, clearly a division he was destined to dominate. And so next we move to another 2-divisional champ, Henry Cejudo. Despite what Henry might tell you, he isn't number 5 on the GOAT discussion. Do I think his return and potential fight against Aljamain could propel him further in the discussion? Absolutely. Returning to dispatch a man who ran through Peter Yan to claim... Wait, did I write that? Oh yeah, ran through Peter Yan's knee, won a silly split decision and beat a cripple. If Henry can beat that man, then definitely he will start his journey on rising higher in the discussion of who the best is. When looking at Henry's career from a bird's eye view, it's actually quite fascinating. In fact, the whole of the bantamweight division has been one of the worst series of title holders since Dominick Cruz was the champ. So I don't think claiming a belt right now is exactly comparable to some of the other people on this list. Henry's record speaks for itself. A controversial split decision win over DJ to become the flyweight champion, defended that belt by beating the EPO out of a wilted and drained TJ, becoming double champ by beating a soon-to-decline Marlon Moraes, and then getting a terrible stoppage victory over Dominick Cruz, who hadn't fought in 4 years. Yeah, doesn't exactly sound great when you put it like that. I love Henry, don't get me wrong, and I can't wait to see his return, but despite double championship status and a gold medal, I don't think that his wins are quite as equal to other people in the higher tiers. I think win streaks and consistent defenses are needed to prove greatness. I have no doubt that Henry is capable of becoming a dominant champion, and I'm one of those people that truly want to see him challenge for a title at featherweight as well. For me, Henry is super close to escaping this tier, and I can't wait to see more out of him. He is one of my favourite fighters and personalities, and so we move to the real bantamweight GOAT,
Dominick Cruz.
For me, as we discussed previously, whilst it is close, the true greatest bantamweight of all time is Dominick Cruz, a man who was the first to rule over the division and only really lost the spot due to injuries. His story and legacy is truly a sad and disturbing account of what life outside of an octagon can do to the career inside of it. It was the subject of my most recent video a couple weeks ago, and so I won't dwell on this too much, but the reason Dom is up here is because what he could have been. And I know that sounds stupid, but just look at the facts. I know MMA maths doesn't always add up, but for the 5 years Dom had been between title fights, out of the fight game, injured, TJ Dillashaw and Renan Barão ruled as kings. TJ would beat Renan, and Dominick would come back after 5 years without a title fight and beat TJ Dillashaw. Dom vicariously ruled that division through these two men all those years. Out of all bantamweights of that era, somehow a decade later, Dom remains in the top 10 to this day, whilst the rest have either retired or gone on lengthy loss streaks. That to me is truly incredible. And like I say, if you want to know more, please go and look at my previous video, because trust me, Dom deserves to be in this tier, along with Amanda Nunes. There is no female fighter on planet Earth more decorated in MMA than Amanda Nunes, and so it is a no-brainer that she makes it into tier 4. But wait, didn't she get submitted by Juliana Pena? Yeah. Alright, so the best female fighter in the world got submitted and outstruck by Juliana Pena. Anyway, moving on to Alexander Volkanovski. Now I wrote a lot of this video in January, so that gives you a quick peek behind the curtain. Yes, this is how long it takes when working on multiple projects to make a video, so a lot of the information is outdated, like the Valentina Shevchenko section. The only one that I've come back to rewrite is Volkanovski, as I feel that that's the one that probably should change with how it's worded. I wanted so badly to change his spot on the list to the tier up with another fighter which I'll mention later in the next tier, but ultimately I can't be asked to spend 2 hours re-editing it. His performance against Islam is truly remarkable, and I think if they do a rematch in the future, that is going to be a completely different tale. It really shows how great Alexander the Great is. Volkanovski has collided with the best at featherweight from his run to the title to all of his defenses, and if he continues for the next few years racking up defenses in that division, then there is no doubt that he'll go down as the greatest featherweight of all time. He still falls just short of Aldo for me, but he is chasing that legacy down, and if he can get his hands on that lightweight belt, then he certainly has a shot at going against the top of this pyramid, and his competition against Islam proved that he is more than worthy to pick up that strap. He has nothing but time left in the game, and he is only 34, right in his prime. Alexander sat comfortably in the pound for pound #1 spot for the whole of 2022, and he is tied with Arnold Allen for the most consecutive wins at featherweight, sitting at 10, and consecutive title fight wins at 5 with Max, and is 3 defenses away from tying things up with Aldo. The horizon for Alexander is looking extremely positive, and I can't wait to see his next fight. Out of all the fighters on this pyramid, this is the one with the most potential to keep climbing, and he is joined on the list with another all-time great, Cain Velasquez. Cain Velasquez is often called the scariest heavyweight of all time, an American-born NCAA wrestler that would enter the UFC on a 2-fight winning streak, debuting against Brad Morris, showcasing his power with a devastating first-round KO. He would have another 5 bouts, all of which but one resulting in finishes, notably fighting against the likes of Big Nog and Ben Rothwell. Cain's career was clearly aligning with the then UFC champion and albino orc that is Brock Lesnar. Cain and his relentless cardio would bludgeon and end Gorthmog's title reign by turning him into a bloody pulp, a fight in which, let me remind you, he was supposed to lose against the steroid-infused wrecking ball that is Brock Lesnar. As champion, Cain's first title defense would be against Junior Dos Santos, a fight that he would ultimately lose, but one that he would win twice, making the best trilogy the heavyweight division had ever seen. The thing with Cain is that, due to injuries, we never truly got to see what his career would have looked like, but there is one thing for sure, there has been no one that has the skill set and cardio like him at heavyweight, and his run before losing the title and fading from the sport was what truly encapsulates to be one of the greatest heavyweights to ever do it. The 2-time heavyweight champ has the second most knockdowns at heavyweight and the most takedowns and strikes landed in the UFC heavyweight division. These records are no light order, and it rightly places him in tier 4 along with Matt Hughes. Matt Hughes, the former 2-time welterweight title holder and 2-time Hall of Famer, rightly earns a spot in tier 4. He has the most wins in welterweight history and holds spectacular wins over other men on this pyramid in the form of GSP, BJ Penn and Royce Gracie. Matt was a true pioneer for the sport, competing since the very beginning of MMA just 2 years after the sport had started. He was a true wrecking ball in the cage, picking up and slamming his opponents with his so-called farmer strength. If it wasn't for the fact that his autobiography is the single-handedly one of the worst things that I've ever read in my entire life, I'd probably talk about him more, but that book is a plague on this sport, and if I hadn't been essentially forced into reading it, maybe I'd like Hughes more. Check out Napoleon Bonaparte's video called The Golden Age of the Ultimate Fighter for more information as to why that book is so disgusting. disgusting. And so next we move to Chuck Liddell. When I think of what defines the history of the UFC, this is the man I think of. That grainy footage of Chuck the Iceman Liddell scrapping it out with Tito Ortiz as Dana White rejoices ringside is truly what makes me nostalgic for a time that I never even got to witness. His knockouts and post-fight celebrations are the first thing that assaulted my eyes when YouTube decided to start recommending me fight highlights. At the time, I couldn't quite understand what was going on. Why are men in a cage fighting each other? Who is this guy with a mohawk? But now, as a seasoned fan of MMA, with the knowledge of what this man has accomplished at light heavyweight, I think I finally understand why the UFC had their very own live-action Iceman vs Firestorm, inspired by the X-Men comics. From 1998 to 2006, Chuck Liddell was a terrifying force in the UFC, and whilst he would have his obligatory fall-off at the end of his career, his 4 title defenses and induction into the UFC Hall of Fame speaks for itself. He was a superstar in his own right, perhaps the very first one for the UFC, selling over 5 million pay-per-view buys. When we talk about legends of the sport, this is the man that they're referring to, and the legacy of the UFC goes hand in hand with Chuck, along with another man who joins him as the last entry on tier 4, Randy Couture. Winner of the UFC 13 tournament, 2-time heavyweight champion and 2-time light heavyweight champion, UFC Hall of Famer and NCAA Division I wrestler, the oldest fighter to win a championship at 43, and then the oldest fighter to defend the title at 44. If that doesn't speak of longevity in this sport, one that wears its practitioners down to the bone, then I don't know what does. Although his record sitting at 19 wins and 11 losses doesn't exactly summarize his greatness, his achievements certainly do. He was always fighting the best of the 2 divisions that he competed in. From bouts with Vitor Belfort to Chuck Liddell to Tim Sylvia, Randy was a true legend of the game. He even holds the record for the most UFC title fights at 15. Actually, Jon Jones just broke that record at 16 last weekend. In 2010, the UFC would make the first Hall of Famer versus Hall of Famer when they put Randy Couture in the cage with Mark Coleman. There is for me no better way to round off this tier with the man himself, Randy, a pioneer and someone who will always be remembered in the hearts of fight fans. And so now we go up a notch and we enter tier 3. And so starting off tier 3, we have Khabib Nurmagomedov.
But you can't do this to me.
What? How can you do this? This is outrageous.
Perhaps the entry on this list which is going to upset a bunch of people the most is Khabib all the way down here. But you need to just sit down and listen for 2 seconds rather than smashing your keyboard. This list and Khabib's place on it is not a denial of how great he could have been. You can only gauge someone's achievements with how much they have actually achieved, not how much they could have. There is obviously a slight difference. Trust me, Khabib with only a couple more years in the sport could have easily made it to the #1 spot. And so listen to what I'm saying there. Easily. But he didn't. He retired young in the game. And that's it. That's why he's down here in tier 3. Khabib was clearly one of the most dominant fighters the sport had ever seen, and his rise to claim and defend the title was simply unbelievable. But people aren't wrong when they suggest that his first 20 fights were gifted to him. Now that is common for a lot of combat athletes, but Khabib had an easier road than most. He won the title off of Al Iaquinta, and one of his defenses was against a man who is literally 1-3 at lightweight. None of this is his fault, clearly, and him retiring so young is something a lot of fighters should do. There is no doubt in my mind that Khabib could have become a 2-divisional champ either, but he didn't. I feel like I have to vehemently defend my choice for putting him on this tier for some reason, because I know how crazy some people are going to be, but I guess that's why I have to just say and remind you that this is my list. I think it's important to also consider that when you see the rest of the people on this tier, that he is surrounded by generational, hell, even multi-generational talent, and that is no small feat, especially in this sport. Khabib is one of the best fighters on the planet, but in terms of actual achievements and considering the opponents that he's faced, I think he sits comfortably in this tier. If this was a list about who is the best fighter, not the greatest fighter, then that would be 2 very different conversations, and I'm sure that he would be in the top 5. But greatness is not about just how dominant or technical you were. There's a whole other slew of reasons. And so yeah, Khabib Nurmagomedov in tier 3. But let's leave no doubt, Khabib was a devastating force in the lightweight division and was a true ambassador for his people, religion, and for the sport. A Hall of Famer and certainly one of those practitioners that transcend the sport. It really is a shame that we didn't get to see more of him, but that speaks more to the respect he has for his family than anything else. He will be missed, and I enjoyed watching his rise, but the tier moves swiftly on to Jose Aldo. There are no greater words for the King of Rio than the greatest featherweight of all time. His rise through the WEC and the UFC was unrivaled. His decade-long dominance over his division was simply one of the most impressive feats this sport has ever known. It earned him a spot in the UFC Hall of Fame earlier this year, and there was no one more deserving. He earned the WEC featherweight belt, in which he would defend once before being promoted to the UFC featherweight champion, where he would defend that title 7 times. A hiccup to Conor McGregor on his own path to greatness would set back Jose temporarily, as he would claim the title once more from Frankie Edgar. After bumping into 2 more fighters on a crash course up the GOAT pyramid in Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski, Jose would drop down to bantamweight, where he would find on and off again success, even challenging for the title against Peter Yan. He would retire at the end of 2022, a legend of the sport, and one that truly defines what it means to be great. And he is joined on this list by another man who personifies greatness, Fedor Emelianenko. Out of anyone on this tier, Fedor is perhaps the one I struggled with having him here or on the tier up. If it wasn't for the fact of Stipe's existence, then I think he would be up one other tier. That and ultimately his unfortunate Strikeforce run. Like I said, no singular loss should factor in, but to me, I couldn't avoid the fact that as soon as Fedor came to the West, away from the rather controversial and supposedly oftentimes rigged Pride matches, he went on a 3-fight skid. Against great fighters, don't get me wrong, so it doesn't knock him too far down, but definitely enough to put him in this tier rather than the one up. But I definitely don't want to take away from the fact that this man went on a decade-long, unbelievable crusade at heavyweight. Before his losses, Fedor had notched up 31 wins, 1 loss and 1 no contest, which is just unbelievable considering that the man was undersized at heavyweight. There is no surprise to me that Fedor is one of the most loved legends of this sport, and his time in Pride will forever be a shimmering light in the annals of the past. From defeating UFC heavyweight legends Mark Coleman, Big Nog and Tim Sylvia to defeating Asian legends, Fedor was an intimidating force in the division. And if you want to learn more about why he belongs here and why he is quite possibly the greatest heavyweight of all time, then my words fall short of Patrick Gavier's incredible documentary on the man. So please go and check it out on his channel. Fedor's legacy will never fade from the sport, and whilst I personally missed his career as I was too young to watch it, going back and watching his fights is truly a special thing to witness, and I highly recommend watching all of his fights. Fedor rightly sits amongst true greatness on this tier, and we move on to another heavyweight in Daniel Cormier. Olympian, NCAA Division I wrestler, wrestling world champion, Strikeforce heavyweight Grand Prix winner, 2 divisional champion with multiple defenses at light heavyweight and heavyweight, the baddest man on the planet for a short time. Daniel Cormier will be known as one of the greatest fighters of all time. He had spent the last half of his career going from title fight to title fight. In that time period, he would lose only to the greatest light heavyweight of all time, Jon Jones, and the greatest heavyweight of all time, Stipe. And that to me is as defining of a legacy as you can ever have, falling short only in dances with greatness. Not only was Daniel dominant in his outings against the top contenders that he would face, he graced the sport with a personality that made him a true ambassador for mixed martial arts. But his career will be forever immortalized as one of the greatest when he challenged Stipe to become a simultaneous 2-divisional champ in an electrifying performance, one that warmed the hearts of fans and world over. His career could have quite possibly had a different trajectory had he not moved down to light heavyweight for the sake of one of his best friends and training partners, Cain Velasquez. But being the first fighter to defend 2 divisional belts at the same time is as impressive as any achievement in this sport, especially considering Daniel was on the wrong side of 30 at the time, well past his prime and dealing with back issues. Cormier had a relatively short career in mixed martial arts, starting very late after a successful and accomplished wrestling career, and for me, he rightly sits in the top echelon of this pyramid. And now we move on to 2 inclusions on the list that might upset some people, but I want to start by saying that both Israel Adesanya and Kamaru Usman before their last fights were in the discussion for the greatest welterweight and middleweights ever, just millimeters from competing with the legacy of GSP and Anderson Silva, who are yet to come on this pyramid as well. Just because they lost their fights in the closing minutes of 5-round competitions should not ever mar their achievements. I have absolutely no idea why I put Israel Adesanya in this tier. I think probably even Kamaru is a bad shout, but I'm like looking back on this now and I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, Israel Adesanya entered into MMA as an experienced and decorated kickboxer. He would continue to compete in both of these sports for several years until 2018, which would see him make his UFC debut as an 11-0 undefeated mixed martial artist. There was so much hype surrounding his debut. People were truly excited to see his potential in the UFC, and he would not disappoint, going on to become the middleweight champion as an undefeated fighter. He would maintain that O at middleweight until last year when longtime kickboxing rival would knock him out, Alex Pereira. But by this time, he had already cemented his legacy worthy of a Hall of Famer, racking up 5 title defenses and attempting double championship status, but ultimately falling short to Jan. Israel never had an easy matchup in the division and was always fighting the rightful next contender. Even if it did lead to some boring fights, Israel proved to be a dominating force in the division, and he ruled over it for many years. There are very few champions as skilled as he is, and the fact that his wrestling improved so much goes to show that he is a student of the game and never grew too egotistical to stop working on all elements of the game. His storied career in multiple disciplines and the fact that he started MMA late into his life is the reason he ranks so high. I think the reason that I'm going to keep both of these fighters in this tier is because I can imagine people seeing the thumbnail and just absolutely losing their mind, so I'm just going to keep them here. But in all seriousness, like, what I say about them still stands. But I think looking at the tier that I would probably, I don't want to go with recency bias, but I think I would move Alexander in place of Israel. And I think Kamaru and Matt Hughes are probably the swap to make, I think. And so next we move to Kamaru. Kamaru Usman, the man with the most consecutive wins in welterweight history, was an easy inclusion on tier 3 for me. The man who had come closest to rivaling his welterweight peer GSP, but has been somewhat derailed by Leon Edwards. He was the Ultimate Fighter Season 21 winner and the welterweight champion with 5 consecutive defenses. Kamaru had a long road to getting his title shot, but when he got that strap wrapped around his waist, he went on a dominant run through the division, consistently fighting the next guy in line and seemingly clearing out the division. This video will be released probably the day after the rubber match between himself and Leon, but I don't think that result, regardless of win or loss, will exactly change his place on this list. For me, he will always be remembered for his fights with Colby, some of the best and most competitive the welterweight division had ever seen. There is no doubt in my mind that Kamaru will go down as a Hall of Famer and one of the best fighters to ever do it. Yes, I'm salty that he beat Colby, but I feel like after it's all said and done, Kamaru definitely belongs in tier 3. And so we move on to Stipe. In a world where people can't decide between who the best heavyweight is, this pyramid comes into play because if you can't decide, then just stick them both on the same tier. Fedor and Stipe will always be vying for that #1 spot. And the determinant, unless you are Dana White, of who actually is the best is literally who you grew up watching. Those who missed the legacy of Fedor often turn to the UFC heavyweight with the most title defenses at the weight class, Stipe, as the man to fill the shoes. And rightly so. He is perhaps the most complete heavyweight we have ever seen in the octagon. Great wrestling, great striking, and the heart to get him through any fight. The 2-time heavyweight champion managed to notch 4 defenses into his belt, his first run as champion totaling 3 defenses, the most any heavyweight has ever done consecutively. And when you consider that this man has maintained his spot as the baddest man on the planet for so long, whilst being a firefighter in his hometown, is simply unbelievable and shows the type of man that Stipe is. His losses to both Cormier and Francis were both quick and devastating, but also par for the course with heavyweights, I feel. He is 1-1 with Francis and would end up winning the rubber match against Daniel. The man with the most performances of the night at heavyweight to me embodies what a champion and what a martial artist stands for: respect and honor. That night he won the belt in Brazil, silencing the home crowd, will always be one of the most special moments the sport has ever seen. And although Alistair Overeem clearly felt a tap, his legacy at heavyweight is one of the greatest the sport has ever seen. And I think that quite rightly he rounds off tier 3. So here we are. Now we get to the final 2 tiers, and ultimately, if you are keeping count, the last 4 fighters. Let's not wait around and get straight into it with the first fighter on this tier, Anderson Silva, owner of one of the longest win streaks in UFC history, a record that is constantly being upheld as those attempting to break it fall just short. Volkanovski and Islam seemingly with the greatest chance to rival it. A shame one of them will lose that attempt in just a couple weeks. Shooter Boxing delivers onto us its final member for the pyramid. Now I don't know if that camp just trains the greatest athletes or there is literally just no other gym to train at in Brazil, but either way, good for them for producing some of the greatest talents over the years. Silva's early years were spent in the likes of Pride, Cage Rage and Shuto, fighting violent British gang members and Asian superstars like Yushin Okami. It was only in his second fight in the UFC that Anderson would step in against the current middleweight title holder Rich Franklin, way back in 2006 at UFC 64. From there, Anderson would would go on to chisel out his face on the Mount Rushmore of MMA. It wasn't just the win streak or the people that he was beating, it was how he was doing it. With only 2 decisions in a 16-fight win streak, Anderson looked dominant and unbeatable. Well, besides that one time Chael was a couple minutes from becoming a champion. But Silva showed his heart and resilience by staying in the fight till the very last moment. Anderson became an idol for aspiring martial artists. His style was unique, showboaty and elusive, a skill set that has confused opponents and put on a show for the fans. Silva is the epitome of greatness, and I am sure his legacy will remain in the top echelon of the sport indefinitely. Whilst his latter career would trail off, I don't think that has any effect on what came before it. After all good things do come to an end. Whether it was front kicks, submissions or knees ending the fight, Silva was always putting on performance of the night consecutively, and that is perhaps the most defining aspect of Anderson's legacy. He was dominant for so long, but completely and utterly lethal with it, and I think we know why, because on a makeshift episode of MTV Cribs, Anderson would reveal his secret steroid collection. Not that it bears any weight on my decision, I just think that it's funny that he keeps his roids next to Air Jordans. Either way for me, Anderson falls just short of the #1 spot. And so next we have Demetrious Johnson. He would burst into the UFC with 1 loss on his record to the legendary UK fighter Brad Pickett, and with a few wins in the organisation had deservedly earned a shot at the bantamweight king Dominick Cruz. The fight didn't exactly go his way, but a couple losses doesn't really tell the whole story of this fighter. See, Demetrious Johnson was inherently placed at a disadvantage from the beginning of his career. DJ was considerably undersized at bantamweight, but he had no option to fight at a lower weight class as the UFC had yet to open their flyweight division. Immediately after the second loss of his career, Dana White would announce the 4-man tournament that would crown a man atop a new division, the flyweights. And well, you know the story. Johnson would not only claim the throne, he would sit upon it for the next several years, racking up win after win, from KOs to last-second finishes to flying armbars. Johnson clung onto the title of flyweight champion for 11 straight title defenses, breaking Anderson Silva's long-standing record. A controversial split decision to Henry Cejudo would provide the opportunity for DJ to willingly escape the UFC in favour for 1 championship, where after 3 wins he would claim the World Grand Prix title and a promise at the reigning flyweight champion, Adriano Moraes. In what is perhaps one of the biggest upsets in recent memory, Adriano would become the first to finish DJ, but Johnson, showing how resilient he is, would avenge that loss, but not before a super fight with Rodtang in a mixed rules competition. Demetrious put himself in the top 4 discussion of the greatest of all time by being the most dominant UFC champion of all time, and then also getting himself a title in another major organisation. But perhaps the greatest thing about him is how well he mixes all martial arts. His skill set is unrivaled, technically brilliant in essentially every aspect of the sport, and so there is no doubt in my mind that DJ sits in tier 2. And so here we go, the final 2. Well, taking up the last spot in tier 2 is George St-Pierre.
Are you intoxicated?
And so now by this point you will have worked out who I personally have at number 1, so let me explain GSP's inclusion on this tier and not tier 1. I think for me, when it's so difficult to pick apart who should stand as the greatest, the minutiae of their career truly matters. And so we end this tier with the most dominant welterweight of all time, who was closely being trailed by Kamaru Usman before being melted by a shin to the dome courtesy of Leon Edwards. GSP was a 2-time welterweight title holder and doubled up with the middleweight title to become the 4th double champion in history. There isn't much that hasn't already been said about him. He is the epitome of respect and honour that martial arts are known for, and his dominance over the division he ruled over is unrivaled. For me, I think that his double championship status is one of the weakest out of the double champs, so it didn't really factor much into my decision. I love Bisping, don't get me wrong, but he isn't exactly the best middleweight ever, despite his one-eye mythical status. GSP suffered 2 losses in his career, but would go on to avenge these missteps in devastating fashion, proving each time that he was probably the better fighter, but fell short to a puncher's chance most athletes are afforded in this ruthless game. With 12 consecutive title fights and 9 title defense win streak, never missing weight, never testing positive or getting DQ'd, this UFC Hall of Famer will undoubtedly remain in the discussion of the greatest for eternity. Perhaps it might be his dedication to martial arts that separates him, practicing karate from the age of 7 through to changing up his game in mixed martial arts to a dominant wrestling style. GSP could be feared in almost every aspect of the game, and that is truly remarkable. When talking about greatness, I think it requires a complete game, and that is where GSP, DJ, and the next fighter really shine. They just mix everything together wonderfully. GSP's dominance and fascination with aliens will forever be notched into the history of MMA, and he deservedly sits atop most people's GOAT list. But for me, there is Jon Jones. And you know, there was a lot of back and forth in my mind of who was to make it here. But UFC 285 changed everything. If this list was to include the vast array of controversies and alleged PED usage, then of course he wouldn't even be in the discussion for the greatest of all time. But this is about an athlete, and for me, Jon Jones, fresh off the press of winning the UFC heavyweight crown in a dominant and lopsided performance, easily surpasses his peers. 14 title fight wins, 11 title defenses, Hall of Famer, 8 performances of the night, 18 fight active unbeaten streak, 1 loss, which, let's face it, isn't a loss, 7.2 million disclosed pay-per-view buys, the youngest champion in UFC history, and finally, the newest 2-divisional UFC champion, bringing alongside with it the baddest man on the planet moniker. Despite almost decades in this sport, his peak is seemingly now. He has fought in 2 different eras, but also beat basically every light heavyweight champ that came before him. He has come out virtually unscathed in every competition, and whilst some decisions may have been marred by controversies, the fact is 12 years on top of one of the divisions he fought in, constantly fighting the next guy in line, and essentially not missing a beat, is an impressive feat if ever there was one. Even his entrance into the UFC was unbelievable. Within 4 months of turning pro, not only had he made his UFC debut, he had already won all 7 of his fights. That to me is simply crazy. Jones would put on a performance of his lifetime to win the belt at just 23 against Shogun and remain at the top for the rest of his career. When we compare him to those in the tier below, there isn't much wiggle room, and I fully accept that others would most probably swap between him and GSP or Mighty Mouse. But to me, what it is, it's the fact that he's never lost. He has been at the top for so long and maintained it. He has never been finished, unlike the other 2, which is massive in my reasoning for him being up here. In a game of inches where losing by a lucky punch or a strike you never saw coming can be a detriment to a legacy, I try my best to understand that this is just the brutal reality of this sport, and no singular loss should factor massively into the discussion. We as MMA fans accept that losses happen regardless of greatness. The fact is, just like the others before him on this list, he has also played this game of inches, and in all those years has avoided that eventuality. And so yes, whilst I do think GSP and DJ getting knocked out isn't a massive blemish, it's so important to remember that Jones has been provided the exact same opportunity to lose just as they have, but he avoided it. And funny enough, Khabib to me is the only one who ever had the opportunity to rival this man, but sadly, he left the sport and doomed his potential. GSP, Silva and DJ ultimately have either lost in devastating ways or are no longer active in the sport, leaving Jones to continue his legacy and attempt to further the discussion of who the greatest is. With the heavyweight crown upon his head and a fight with heavyweight GOAT Stipe on the horizon, that discussion is fading. Feel free to fight your case in the comments as to who you have at number 1, but I think it's important to understand with every potential defense Jones has of the heavyweight belt, that argument grows weaker and weaker. But let's be honest, none of this discussion even matters, because there is another tier beyond this, one that transcends my opinion, your opinion, god damn it, the opinion of every mortal on earth. There is one man, nay, one god who presides over the pyramid. He is the undefeated, undisputed, never lost a round, the American gangster. He is the bad guy, the goat slayer, the one and only Chael P. Sonnen.
When you're the best fighter in the world today, they got a name for you. They don't call you a great fighter, they call you Chael Sonnen. Beat me if you can.